There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of sexual violence. Listener discretion is advised. It was 2018 when 23-year-old Saxon Mullins came out and said the 4 words, "I am that girl." People had heard what had happened to a young woman in a laneway behind the Soho nightclub in Sydney's King's Cross. They heard what a man, Luke Lazarus, son of the nightclub owner, had said to her. The public was also aware of what happened next. But it took 5 years for Saxon to say those words, "I am that girl," and she said them to ABC journalist Louise Milligan. Then there was Paris Street. In early 2020, a Four Corners episode was aired which investigated the claims made by Paris Street, a student at St Kevin's College in Melbourne. Paris was in Year 9 when he began receiving text messages from his coach at the time, Peter Keogh. Mr Keogh told Paris he thought his thighs were gorgeous, that he was hot stuff and perhaps he needed a hug. He wrote, "I love you," and suggested this was a case of unrequited love. The messages escalated, and after an incident at Mr Keogh's house, Paris finally spoke to his mother. Like Saxon, Paris would become a witness in court, telling men much older and much more powerful than him the details of the most shameful and traumatic moments of his life. Both Saxon and Paris did what they were meant to. They reported alleged assault and abuse. They turned up to court. They sat in the witness box and they told their stories. But, Louise Milligan asks, at what cost? I'm Jessie Stevens and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with investigative journalist Louise Milligan, a reporter for the ABC's Four Corners program and Walkley Award-winning author. Her most recent book is called Witness, an investigation into the brutal cost of seeking justice, in which she explores Australia's legal system and how it treats witnesses. She gives us a glimpse into a world so many of us will never see and explores the stories of various witnesses, including Saxon Mullins and Paris Street. Saxon Mullins is a name that's been etched into the minds of many Australians. What do you remember about the first time you met Saxon?
Yeah, I'll never forget the first time I met Saxon. It was at a sort of cavernous, nondescript bar in Sydney, and my producers had asked me to go and see if she would be interested in speaking to Four Corners because they thought that the story that she might have to tell about her ordeal was exactly the sort of story that suits my type of journalism. And we struck up an immediate rapport. And she's a gorgeous, gorgeous woman. She is the sort of person, and I say this in the book, that when you meet her, it's like she's too good to be true, that there must be a catch here, you know. She's a good victim, you know. She's the sort of person that the tabloids, you know, as a victim, they used to put them in an oval back in the day, you know, like this, the person that everyone can kind of relate to. And there wasn't a catch, you know. She was good and she was true. And she's a very straightforward, quite shy but lovely person who had been through a terrible ordeal. And it had happened when she was only 18 years old and she was, you know, a virgin. I hate using that word, but the fact is she hadn't ever had sex before. She was a, you know, teenager from the Central Coast on her first night out in King's Cross. And she was pretty unworldly in lots of ways, although intelligent and sparky and lovely. And we just, as I say, struck up this immediate rapport. And I said to her, I promise you that I'm going to look after you. And I did. And, you know, it ended up taking a year before we could actually broadcast the Four Corners about Saxon Mullins' story, I Am That Girl. But when we did, Australia loved her just as much as I did.
Yeah, she was and is a young woman who I think her story affected a lot of people. For listeners who might not recall, can you give us an overview of what happened to Saxon in May 2013? Could you tell us what took place and what parts of that night are actually contested?
Yeah, absolutely. So Saxon, as I said, was going out on her first night out in King's Cross. She had taken the train down from the Central Coast with her best friend, Brittany Watts, and they were going out nightclubbing. And at the time, the nightclub that was, the big thing was Soho. And this is before the lockdown laws, sort of changed the Cross. And Soho was owned by a pub baron called Andrew Lazarus, who had a young son called Luke. And when Saxon got to Soho, she had quite a bit to drink because she'd been to a couple of other places and she'd had a few, conservatively 10 standard drinks, which is, a lot for an 18-year-old who hasn't really had much to drink at all before. And she got to Soho, she was on the dance floor, she met Luke Lazarus, the owner's son, and he said, did she want to come to a VIP area? The stories are reasonably similar here, but he seems to have taken her briefly to a DJ booth, and then he brought her down through the cloakroom and out the back of the club. And she didn't really know where she was going, and it was a dark alleyway out the back of Soho. And Saxon says she was terrified. And basically, within 5 minutes of meeting her, it started. And it was him asking her to put her hands on the wall/fence, get down on her hands and knees in the gravel. And he tried to vaginally penetrate her, and when he couldn't, he anally penetrated her. Now, the nub of the thing was that every fact finder, every jury and judge who looked at this, and I'll get to the court case in a second, accepted that Saxon Mullins did not consent to anal sex as her first experience of sex, didn't consent to what happened that night. But what was ultimately found is that Luke Lazarus didn't know that she wasn't consenting. And I have always thought, maybe there is a woman on the face of the earth who would elect to have, frankly, unlubricated anal sex as her first sexual experience on her hands and knees in a dark alley in the gravel. I haven't met that person yet. And it was a very humiliating experience for Saxon, to say the very least, and a very traumatic experience. And she ran out of the laneway and found her friend Brittany and just absolutely dissolved in tears. And, when Brittany described it to me, she was just inconsolably crying, because she said, Saxon's not a crier. She said, I'm the crier. Saxon's not a crier, but Saxon was just sobbing and, was in so much pain from what had happened that she couldn't sit down properly on the train on the way home. And the same the next day, her sister, Arnica, who's a beautiful woman, said, you need to go and report this. And Saxon agreed that she would. She didn't have a shower or anything like that. She did all the things that you're supposed to do, and she went to report it to police the next day and was examined at Royal North Shore Hospital. And that was basically the start of a 5-year ordeal that ended in pretty much, how would you put it? It ended up in limbo for everyone concerned legally.
And you said before that she was almost as much, and we say this knowing that it's a problem, but that she was as much of the perfect victim as you can get. She reported it the next day. There was CCTV evidence. She was white. She was clever. She texted her sister about it. And the fact that she was a virgin is something that a courtroom historically would use in her favour, as problematic as that is. What did the defence actually try to suggest about Saxon in the courtroom? Like, what was the essence of their defence and how did it attack her?
The essence of the defence was that she was a woman jilted because after the sex, putting it broadly, happened, Luke Lazarus asked Saxon to put her name into his phone. Now, she did that, and he would later say it was part of a trophy list of women that he had as sexual conquests. And he showed the list of women that he'd had. And he was trying to say that basically Saxon was furious when she found out that she was but a trophy, another sort of notch on his bedpost, and that was what motivated her to cry rape. Saxon says she didn't even know that there were all these other names there. She just mechanically put her name in the phone because she just wanted to get out of there, and she was in shock. Now, in court, his barrister tried to kind of pursue this argument, and it was quite awful for Saxon because all of these things were going through her head at the one time. So for a start, she was just learning that she was part of a trophy list. So she was thinking, and she says this to me in the book, who are those other women? What happened to them? Where did this happen? And she found that very, very distressing. But also she was having to process the fact that they're trying to paint me as this kind of knowing woman scorned who, happily participated in what I think of as a great trauma and then realised I was just being used as a trophy, and so I'm just getting back at someone. And I mean, her whole thing was, what kind of person would go through the ordeal of going through, being medically examined, going through a police process, the very long process before it gets to court, being cross-examined vigorously about every single disgusting detail of this. If you didn't have to go through that, why would you do that? It's such a sort of a strange kind of argument is her view, and I tend to agree. I mean, I just can't imagine why someone would do that. You'd have to be pretty crazy. You would have to have serious, florid mental health issues, I would say, to do something like that. And I've known Saxon for a long time now, 3 years, and I've never seen anything in her that would suggest that. She's a very sort of straight up kind of person, a very nice person and kind person. So that's the sort of thing that she had to go through. But the other thing was they were trying to make her out to be knowing and willful. And so the Crown prosecutor, Mr. Lloyd, kept addressing her as madam. Oh, you wouldn't you, madam? That's what you say, madam, that kind of language. And it was interesting because I actually spoke to Ian Lloyd QC outside of the courtroom as an incredibly charming and kind of garrulous type of person. He's a lot of fun. He acknowledges that he's a very robust advocate when he is in the courtroom, and he couldn't talk about the specifics of this case because barristers aren't permitted to do that. I asked him about the use of the word madam more generally, and he said, well, you have to put some age on her because you can't have the jury thinking of her as this innocent 18-year-old. You've got to think of her as madam. It was so kind of discombobulating for Saxon, the whole experience. And, that's what so many complainants of these crimes who I have spoken to in the research for this book and in my journalism in this area over the past few years more generally have said, it's not only are you reliving a complete and awful trauma, you're also being doubted and tarred with this horrible kind of suspicion and, this sort of reputation. It's like you're, as one person I quoted in the book said, yes, you're the villain instead of the accused. And we do have a principle of beyond reasonable doubt and the presumption of innocence in criminal law, and that is vitally important. I did a law degree and it was drummed into us. A person is innocent until they're proven guilty. But by the same token, does that mean that we have to be so awful to the people who come to these places to tell their story. It seems very unfair, and it also seems like a barrier, because why would you want to put yourself through this? But it also, to me, suggests that anyone who kind of gets to the other side of that, beyond someone who is floridly mentally ill, you'd have to think that there was some truth in their accusations.
You address that tension throughout the book, that it is, of course, innocent until proven guilty, which I don't think any of us are suggesting there's anything wrong with that. But you make a great point about character references and that the defence gets them, but the victim doesn't. How else does the court system favour the accused?
Well, I think particularly in the case of a well-resourced accused, so someone who has money, basically, I would say there is a huge power imbalance in favour of the well-resourced accused, because they sit there in the court, they have a QC or SC, barrister and a junior counsel, they have a solicitor. They watch the entire proceedings and you see them. I mean, I saw it in the Pell case, Cardinal Pell was taking notes when I gave evidence, and they can talk to their barristers and make points about what witnesses say and whatever. And on the other hand, the complainant comes in just for their evidence because they're considered a witness. And as Saxon says, I wasn't a witness to what happened. I didn't hover over my own body and watch it happen. It happened to me. And yet, because they're not considered a party in the court system, that means that they have to be removed from the court for the rest of the proceedings. They don't have those advantages that I talked about that the accused has of, having a lawyer, having a famous barrister, being able to take notes, all of those things. They have none of that. They come in for their evidence, and often they give their evidence off-site to protect them, and then that's it. And then they just walk away, and a lot of the time they don't even know what has gone on for the rest of the case. And sometimes they never find out. The Crown might send them a transcript if they ask for it at the end of it, but a lot of the time it's too distressing for them to really kind of read it after the piece, and it's really tricky. And the misapprehension that a lot of complainants who come forward have, and I had this happen with some of the people that I spoke to for the book, not Saxon per se, but was that they think that the state is acting for them. So they describe the Crown prosecutor as my lawyer, but the state is not acting for them. The state is trying to prove a case beyond reasonable doubt. And sometimes some of the interests of protecting the complainant and proving a case beyond reasonable doubt are kind of at odds. And so a really good example of that is where you have a defence counsel who is really bullying a complainant, and it's making the complainant really distressed and really crying. But the Crown prosecutor thinks, well, it's kind of better that they're crying because I don't want them to be wooden. So you're much too young to remember this, but I remember as a child, when I first came to Australia and I was about 7 or 8 years old, the Lindy Chamberlain case happened. And the big thing was that Lindy Chamberlain was being accused of murdering her child, and Australians would stand around barbecues that summer, I remember, and discuss how she didn't show enough emotion, right? So you don't want Lindy Chamberlain as a complainant in the witness box. You want someone who feels distressed. But the problem with that is it means that the person gets distressed. And if you have a particularly bullying defence counsel, which some of them are, it's really, really awful for the complainant, and they have no one to protect them. They have witness assistants who are social workers who can sort of pass them the tissues and say they're there, but there's no one to actually advise them how to sort of manage this in a legal context. Now, the system doesn't want people to be coached. That's problematic. But by the same token, they could have a better understanding of how it works.
As an outsider, I've heard about rape myths and certain ideas that are really damaging to survivors of sexual assault. And what I found reading the book, you have a lot of sort of transcripts or parts of questioning that took place in court. And I read it and go, how are you still allowed to say that to someone who is claiming, whether the court proves it or not, that they've been a victim of sexual assault? Is there anything to protect these victims? Is there anything in place to protect them from the defence just attacking them needlessly?
Notionally, there is. So there have been a number of protections that have been put in place in the past 10 years or so. A lot of it came out of the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse recommendations, but also out of various Law Reform Commission inquiries, because the system knows that it's failing victims, you know. I mean, one of the key changes has been amendments to the Evidence Act, which disallow improper questioning that has, for example, a harassing or belittling tone, for instance. And so one of the issues I think with that is very often it is about tone. So it's not picked up in the transcript. And if it's not picked up at the time in the court by either the Crown prosecutor or the judicial officer, the barrister just gets away with it. And often what prosecutors have told me has happened, and some barristers as well and other various advocates, is that the defence counsel can be so haranguing and so over the top that the judge has to sort of pick their battles, because if the judge intervenes too much, it becomes potentially an appeal point, that there's some sort of apprehended bias. And I saw that happen, I must say, in my evidence in the Pell case, because it was so relentless. The tone was so belittling the whole way through. It never, ever stopped. The magistrate intervened quite a bit, and you could see that she was at times not intervening at times when perhaps she might have, because otherwise she would be doing it all the time. And lo and behold, at the end of that hearing, and I mean, by the way, I should say the magistrate was incredibly fair and decent and proper, and she was everything that you would want in a judge as far as I could see, or magistrate as she was. But at the end of it, she was accused by Pell's team of having an apprehended bias. So, you know, that's something that can happen. And the other thing that can happen is the Crown prosecutor can sometimes decide to take a low-profile game because they don't want the jury to be too overwhelmed by their arguments. You know, they want to sort of almost give the defence enough rope, if you like. So they just kind of sit back a bit. And again, like this sort of idea that it's sometimes when the witnesses are bullied, it means it's slightly beneficial to the Crown. So, yeah, improper questioning, I think, is a bit of a problem. And it can't really be picked up a lot of the time after the fact, you know, in an appeal context, because it is about the tone. I mean, I examined the St Kevin's victim Paris Street's case for my book. And in that case, it was in the magistrate's court because it was a grooming offence. So it was, you know, it wasn't in a higher jurisdiction. So that means that there's no transcript usually in the magistrate's court unless it's a really high-profile case. And at the time, no one knew about this thing. It was a closed court, a 15-year-old victim. So Paris couldn't get a transcript of his case, but he was given an audio recording, which was really fantastic because I was able to listen to the audio and hear the tone. And it was the same barrister who had cross-examined me, Robert Richter, who'd acted for the Cardinal. And it was exactly the same tone that he used for me, who's, you know, I'm a big girl, I'm a journalist, I'm a professional, I have a law degree, you know, I had a QC advising me and the ABC behind me and a publisher behind me and, you know, I'm in my 40s. Paris was a 15-year-old boy and he spoke to him in the same way. And I just found it heartbreaking to listen to, this kid being spoken to in this way. But a lot of it didn't necessarily transfer to the page, like the sarcasm, the kind of belittling tone, the always questioning. One of the things, Paris wasn't a historical complainant, that is, he complained at the time that the offence happened. But for a lot of child sexual abuse cases, they are historical cases. So the person comes forward often 20 years later or 30 years later because they just can't hold it inside anymore. And when that happens, the reason they haven't come forward before is because they have felt guilt and shame, and they felt that when they came forward, no one would believe them and that they would be bullied in a way like they had been by their perpetrator. And so many people told me and have told the Royal Commission and have told law reform inquiries that it brought them back to that place. You know, it brought them back to feeling alone and scared and disbelieved. And so it's not only re-traumatizing them in the sense that they have to talk about this horrible thing, but it's putting them psychologically back into that place. And that's why a lot of people say that cross-examination is just as bad, if not worse, than the original crime. And that is an appalling indictment on the system. We have to do better than that, because if we don't, and we already know that this is happening, people don't come forward. People don't complain of sexual crimes at the same rate as other offences. The conviction rates are very low as well. But, you know, if we don't, that means that people who do really horrible things to little children and to women and to men from time to time as well get away with it. And that's just not right.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with journalist Louise Milligan, author of Witness, an investigation into the brutal cost of seeking justice. When we look at Saxon, and ultimately, as you say, at the end of that case, it was almost like there were more question marks. Luke Lazarus, was he convicted in the end and then there was an appeal? How did that case actually end?
It went for 5 years. Luke was convicted by a jury and then he appealed, and a retrial was ordered on a technicality, which it was to do with the way that the original judge in the district court had addressed the jury. And then on appeal, it was sent to a judge-alone trial because of the notoriety of the offence. So in New South Wales, there is the option for judge-alone trials. If it's something that has had a lot of media attention and so on, it's considered that the media attention will poison the minds of the jury. So it went to a judge-alone, and that judge, Robin Tupman, was the person who decided ultimately that while Saxon didn't consent, Luke didn't know she didn't consent. And one of the fascinating things about that was that she talked about contemporary morality, and she gave an example, and it was the only example that she did give, of one of the witnesses who was a friend of Luke's who had said that she had had anal sex on first dates. So therefore, it was possible that someone might actually consent to anal sex on a first date. But, I mean, I just don't even see how that's vaguely comparable, because presumably someone who has had anal sex on a first date, that's not their first sexual experience, and it's not done alone in a dark alleyway on your hands and knees in the gravel when, you know, you're scared and you don't know where to turn or what to do. So it's a mystifying, I would argue, decision, and many others have also argued that it's a mystifying decision. However, when it went to the Court of Criminal Appeal on appeal, so the Director of Public Prosecutions appealed Her Honour's decision, the Court of Criminal Appeal decided that she had erred in her reasoning because she hadn't said that she had taken into account certain things that she was required to by law. So whether or not she did take them into account is an open question, but she didn't say that she did. So she had erred, but because it had by that stage been 5 years since the crime took place. There had been 2 trials, 2 appeals, and because Luke Lazarus had already spent time in prison, they decided that it was too much to go again. And so what we had at the end, as I said before, was just limbo. No final decision, no finality. And the following day after our Four Corners story, the New South Wales Attorney General, Mark Speakman, who was very moved by Saxon's situation, referred all of the state's consent laws to a law reform commission inquiry set up by a retired judge. And there have already been some preliminary findings, but that report should be out pretty much any day. These things take a long time because the law has to be, very precise. But the bottom line is that it looks like Saxon Mullins' extraordinary bravery is going to contribute to law reform in New South Wales for other women like her. And I mean, wow, that is just so great.
It feels like her time on the stand for that reason wasn't in vain. My final question is, after watching Saxon on Four Corners and reading your book and reading about what happened to Paris and you when you were a witness yourself, you get to the end and you think, why would I ever want to put myself through that? And I know that there are some victims who still question whether they would make the same decision again. And what I want to know is, what are some of the solutions? What are some things that can change that can really make this process easier for victims who want to seek justice and who want to, in the case of Paris, it appears that he wanted to protect other children to make sure this wouldn't happen to them. What can be done in the court process, do you think?
I think one of the most important things is that complainant witnesses be given legal advice, that they have a lawyer who is there to advise them about the court processes properly beforehand and how to handle themselves in court. You can't be coached, but you can be advised about how to structure your questions and your demeanour and what to not worry about. I remember my barrister talking about, you don't have to answer yes or no. If he is saying something to you that is not true and is making out that someone else said it, if you know it not to be true, don't agree with it, because that's one of the traps that people often fall into. They think, someone else has said it, maybe I've got it wrong. And, and then they sort of change their evidence and then it ends up being completely inconsistent and, all of that sort of stuff. And these are all the sort of tried and true traps that the defence counsel lay for complainants. They've got their bottom drawer of reasonable doubts, they go reasonable doubt shopping. They've done it so many times and the stats bear it out. The low conviction rates bear it out. So I think having a lawyer who can advise on that, but also to sit not at the bar table, because the complainant isn't a party to these proceedings. And if they were at the bar table, that would really change the system. And I don't think that anyone's really ready for a wholesale change of the system in that way. But to be able to sit in court the way that my lawyer was able to be sitting in court, to observe proceedings and to make sure that the Evidence Act improper questioning protocols aren't being breached and that the person's human rights aren't being breached. Because unfortunately, you can't always rely on the judicial officer or the Crown prosecutor to do that for whatever reason. And actually speaking to very experienced Crown prosecutors, they said to me, I think that you would find that if that happened, Crown prosecutors would start picking up their act a bit because there would be some scrutiny over what they did. So I think that's a very good start. But I also think that there needs to be more training for defence counsel, for lawyers who operate in this space and prosecutors about trauma-informed modes of questioning. Because I really don't think that it is necessary or warranted that they should speak in the bullying tone that they often do. And I have seen it done. I worked as a court reporter many years ago and, watched these guys for, many years kind of doing this. And when I say these guys, so often they are guys. And, there are ways of forensically putting a case and finding inconsistencies in a complainant's account without speaking to them like they're a piece of chewing gum on the bottom of your shoe, People deserve dignity and respect. So there should be more education for them. But also I would just appeal to them to show some human decency. Just because you are trying to prove your client's case beyond reasonable doubt and give them the best defence that they can possibly get doesn't mean that you have to treat people with such disdain and discourtesy and disrespect. You can be a better person. And I'm hoping that this book and the discussions around it will help to do that. And that was part of the reason actually why I spoke to so many barristers for this book and judges and, other people involved in this part of the legal profession, because I wanted them to understand that I'm not coming at it from an us and them perspective. This is not just a purely victim-centric kind of perspective. I understand that they too have a very difficult job to do and they have their own traumas. And that's another issue. They often don't address their own trauma. There's nowhere for them sort of to go. It's considered risky to talk about it because, they work for themselves, and if people think they've lost their marbles, then they'll lose their practice. And it's all about, it's a very clubby, collegiate sort of environment, and it's also quite bitchy, frankly. So they worry about that. And what they said to me is that, they cope with the dreadful things that they have to see and talk about, child pornography cases and so on. The way they cope with it is by drinking a lot of the time, drinking with their barrister mates. And a lot of them, or, some of them talked to me about the fact that they had a drinking problem. They admitted that to me off the record, and they talked about well-known barristers who had drinking problems. There was one who a couple of people spoke to me about who they said, drinks half a bottle of scotch a day. He starts drinking before he goes into court to quote unquote get him to the place being the place where he bullies children and women and broken men who were assaulted when they were little kids.
A lot of people don't know what this system or what the process is like until they're in it. And so the book is so elucidating for that reason. And you say that Saxon has affected what's looking like law reform, but so has your work. And so thank you so much for the work you've done, and thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me. And, I really, really hope that people will read this and think about how we can change the system so that people who pluck up a mountain of courage can be treated with the respect that they deserve.
Thank you so much. Thanks to my guest, Louise Milligan. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our executive producer is Zoe Ferguson. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.